Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This is Part 7, Chapter 7, entitled Black and Blue. Toshinori Yagi had been a hero for a long time, for so many years that were filled with fight after fight against villains. He had experienced everything, or at least he thought he had. That was until he showed up, prepared to fight and rescue the entirety of Class 1A. That was until he arrived and there was nothing he could do, just his presence driving away the rest of the villains that hadn't been defeated already. That was until now, when he tried to feel for a pulse in the boy he saw as some type of sun, and he felt nothing. Nothing. The hero didn't even notice the other students nearby. He didn't notice the fact that he was losing his grasp on his muscle form, steam rising from his body. It was only thanks to Cementos raising a wall between them that his secret wasn't revealed. But he had never cared about his secret less than he did right now. All of his focus was on the boy, laying on his back right in front of him, his chest not moving, still as death, his face pale and his eyes closed. Midnight had run off to get aid, but in the meantime Yagi placed the heel of one of his hands on the center of the boy's chest, experience and training kicking in as he tried to distance himself from who he was doing this to. He laid his other hand on the back of his right and began chest compressions, fast and hard. Despite being weaker in this form, he still heard a rib crack, and he had to reel in his strength a bit. Yagi counted to 30 and then applied a rescue breath, the boy's chest rising with Yagi's air. He did one more rescue breath and then went back to chest compressions. "Izuku," he moaned. "Please, breathe." Yagi choked, gasping. Izuku still wasn't breathing, and when Yagi applied 2 fingers against the boy's neck, there was still no pulse. "No." He shook his head, frantic, and gave 2 more rescue breaths before going back to compressions. It was halfway through his 3rd round of chest compressions that the cavalry arrived, medics carrying gear and a stretcher. Yagi reluctantly moved out of the way, watching distantly as they cut the boy's shirt, revealing all the blood that dripped from his face and onto his chest, through his shirt. The medics stuck electrode-looking things to the boy's chest, and then one of them pushed a button and Izuku's body lurched. Yagi flinched, the sight of his successor spasming like that painful to him. "I've got a pulse!" a woman with cerulean hair yelled, and Yagi's breath hitched in his throat. After that, it was pure, organized chaos as all the medics seemed to work as one, knowing exactly what to do. Then they were carrying Izuku away, and the last thing Yagi saw of him was a sight of his unconscious and bloodied face. Shoto was with the rest of his class now, but he was sitting off to the side alone. He had seen the green-haired boy at the very end, when he and Kirishima and Bakugo had arrived, all of them too late. They had all seen the boy in All Might's arms, the blood pouring down his face, a stream of crimson tears. They had been too late. Midoriya had done everything, and now Shoto didn't know what to do. His body shook with leftover adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Both Kirishima and Bakugo seemed in equal states of distress, separated from the rest of the group by themselves. This was their first year of training to be heroes, their first week, and they had gotten their first glimpse into what it was like to be a real hero, and no one was okay. The rest of the class were chattering with each other, the air tense and scared. They were seeking comfort with each other, while some were being tended to by medics and others were speaking with the police. It was chaos, all around him. But everything stopped when the medics climbed the steps of the USJ smoothly and quickly, all of them pulling between them a stretcher with, was that Midoriya? Shoto's body stood, without him commanding it to, and his heart halted. The medics were moving fast, yelling over each other, stating medical facts and things he did not understand. He heard something about blood pressure and heart failure and the words brain hemorrhage and aneurysm. Shoto suddenly felt like he was going to throw up, as he watched them wheel Midoriya into an ambulance and fly away with the siren blaring. He remembered, just this morning, the anxious boy sitting down next to him, his nails bitten down to the quick. He had reminded Shoto of himself, and he had been kind to him. People were never kind to Shoto just for the sake of being kind. They were kind to him because they wanted something. Midoriya hadn't been like that, and for the first time, Shoto had thought maybe he could have a friend. For the first time in his life. But now, he didn't even know if the boy was going to survive. Shota woke up on the second day of his stay in the hospital, the day after the attack, panic arcing through his veins like lightning, and he sat up before he was even fully aware of what he was doing. A hushed voice and a hand on his chest had him lying back down, and he had to blink away the blurriness from his eyes, turning his head. His head must have been bandaged because he could barely see the form of his husband, standing next to him. Shota struggled to form coherent thoughts, his mind muddled and thick like pudding. He recognized the feeling of heavy medication, and he hated it. He forced himself to focus with great difficulty, the blonde's words finally reaching his ears. They had a system for this, for when one of them was waking up in the hospital, or even from a nightmare, it was still the same. It was the same any time one of them woke up in a confused state. Hisashi was gripping his hand tightly, grounding him while his other hand carded through his greasy hair, fingernails scraping comfortingly against his scalp. He whispered words into his ear that increasingly became more clear the longer Shota focused on them. They were all indisputable facts. You're in the hospital. You're okay. You're safe. Your skull is fractured, but there should be no lasting damage. Your elbow is bandaged, but it's expected to heal, though it will leave a large scar. There was no conjecture in the man's voice, no opinions, and only concrete facts, until Shota felt more like himself, and he squeezed Hisashi's hand back. His husband finally released him, and eased back into his own seat. The students, Shota rasped, and that hurt. His throat felt like it had been cleaned with sandpaper, and his tongue felt like a Brillo pad. Almost everyone is relatively unharmed, a few scrapes and bruises, a sprained ankle in one case, but otherwise mostly okay, Hisashi answered softly, still gripping Shota's hand. Midoriya, the erasure hero responded, just as softly. Hisashi looked down, collecting his thoughts. They're not going to know how extensive the damage was until he wakes up. He met Shota's eyes. But he's going to live. What happened? Shota was irritated with the sluggishness of his brain and how difficult it was to collect his memories and thoughts. What did Midoriya do? Asui explained everything. Hisashi reached up with his free hand to run it through his messy blonde hair, visibly torn up. When he looked at Shota again, there were tears in his eyes. You were going to die, Sho. That thing was going to kill you, but Midoriya took it away. And it almost killed him instead, from the inside of his head. How is that possible? Shota asked, recalling the footage of the training they had done on the first day of classes, when Midoriya had sent Bakugo to his mind, and it had hurt him, choosing to ignore the fact that he himself had almost died. He had almost died before, this wasn't a first, he just needed to not think about it. But what he couldn't stop thinking about were the images of Midoriya running toward him, to send the beast away, and then of him falling to his knees, and his last memory, before waking up in the hospital, of All Might's voice gasping out that the boy wasn't breathing, and the horror that had ripped through his very soul at those words. Shota glanced up when he realized that Hisashi was speaking. The pressure in his brain caused a type of aneurysm. All Might told me the technical term for what happened, but I don't remember it. Hisashi shook his head, his voice uncharacteristically soft. He got out of surgery a little bit ago. You've been asleep for a day. He should be waking up any time, thanks to the quirks and the doctors here. His hand. Shota's eyes suddenly widened when he remembered. I saw that villain grab him. I couldn't. Hisashi's hand squeezed his shoulder, halting his thought process. He lost a finger, but that's it. He could have lost so much more if it wasn't for you using your quirk to stop him. Shota swallowed thickly, before sighing. I want to see him. He tried to sit up, but a wave of exhaustion and dizziness had him falling back against the bed with a hiss. Not yet, Sho, Hisashi said wryly, laying a hand on the man's chest as if to keep him in bed. You've only just woken up. You had quite the head injury yourself. Shota watched as his husband leaned over to push a button next to him, presumably to call the nurse. Shota sighed, allowing his eyes to close. He wanted to see Midoriya as soon as possible. Izuku was alone, and he was in a world completely devoid of even plant life or anything at all, really, besides a couple of things here and there in the empty blackness that he couldn't quite seem to see. He himself was covered in the tangible blackness as well. It covered his mouth and his body, and he was stuck. He couldn't move. He remembered the Nomu, and Aizawa, and Yagi crouching in front of him, and he remembered pain. He remembered oh so much pain. He was panicking now, clawing at the inky darkness, clinging to his body and face. He fell backward, but didn't actually descend anywhere. He was neither sitting on anything solid, nor was he falling, and he didn't exactly feel like he was floating either, like with Uraraka. He felt like gravity just didn't exist. Izuku looked around him fearfully. Nothing existed. Izuku was terrified of many things, but after a life of being alone, that was one of the things that scared him most. Where was he? Why was there nothing around? "Ah, you've finally figured it out," a voice said, and Izuku flinched. Or at least, as much as he could flinch. The boy looked up to see a large, muscular man standing before him with a strange look on his face. "You're in your mindscape." Izuku's eyes widened, and they flashed around. This was his mindscape. Yagi described it as a beautiful field, and his mom described it as a hellscape, but this was just empty. "I'm Daigoro Banjo," the man said, leaning forward expectantly. Izuku tried to answer, but nothing happened. No sound came out of him at all, the darkness over his mouth preventing him from using it. You can't speak," Daigoro said, peering at him and scratching his hairless head. "I know your name anyway, we all do." He looked around, and Izuku's brows went together. He could only see one person in front of him. "Anyway, we weren't supposed to meet you so soon. Do you know why you're here?" Izuku shook his head violently, from side to side, and the man laughed. "It's because you're dead, boy." Izuku jerked back spastically, eyes wide as dinner plates. "Don't act so surprised. You were reckless and careless with your given quirk. You barely even understand it, and yet you did all that. That, boy, is what gets people killed. Don't you know who you are?" Izuku shook his head again, tears in his eyes. He had long since given up on trying to remove the black stuff now. Daigoro suddenly straightened, glancing around him. Izuku followed his line of sight and saw a light. Finally, something in the abyss. "Well, guess you're going to live after all. It was good to meet you, boy. I'm sure we'll see each other again soon." The bald man stepped back, and Izuku looked back at the light. It was moving fast, with the sound of a loud thump that jarred his whole world, shaking him, causing him to feel like he was falling as the thump increased in volume and speed. Just before it reached him, he looked up at the man in fear, but he was laughing, head thrown back. And then the light hit him, slamming into him with the feeling of confusion and pain. Izuku woke up in bits and pieces, his entire body numb and his mouth thick. He could register voices, but not tones or pitch. This happened several times, and Izuku couldn't tell the difference between when he was awake and when he was asleep. Eventually, he could begin to take in more sound and feel the air in his nose as well as the pain in his head and lights outside of his eyelids, and he realized that he wanted to see. He wanted to be awake. He forced his eyelids to flicker open, and the light assaulted him, and he immediately clenched his eyes shut. There was a click, and then the light was gone, and Izuku sighed in relief, opening his eyes again. His eyes were blurry at first, and he could see movement through his squinted eyes, but not who or what it was. He blinked, hearing a voice, trying to see and to understand. He raised shaky hands to rub his hands. After a moment of that, another hand fell on his own to pull them away. When he looked over this time, he could see better. Enough to recognize Yagi's aura, at least. Well enough to see his mentor's utterly exhausted expression. "Izuku," his deep, comforting voice said, and Izuku's breath hitched. He was scared. He was all of a sudden really, really scared, and a harsh beeping burst through the air. Yagi's eyes widened, and he stood, leaning forward, his arms enclosing Izuku as if he couldn't help himself. Izuku wondered why he was already sitting up, if he had been sleeping. "You're safe, young Izuku. You're safe and you're here, at the hospital. You're okay." The man's arms were gentle, but very solid around him, bringing his terror down. Izuku didn't even know why he was so scared, and it was frustrating him. He felt like there was something really important he should be thinking about, but he didn't even know why he was at the hospital. When the beeping sound eased, Yagi leaned back into his chair. Izuku opened his mouth to ask why he was in the hospital, but all that escaped him was a painful grating noise leaving Izuku's throat that had him curling in toward himself. Barely a second had passed before a hand beneath his chin was gently tugging his head up, and the edge of a glass was pressed against his lips. Izuku's eyes flicked toward Yagi, who nodded at him to drink. Izuku inhaled and then let Yagi help him drink. The water wasn't cold, but it soothed his throat immensely, and when it was pulled away, he immediately wanted more. He looked back to Yagi instead, as the man set the glass down on a small table. Izuku opened his mouth to try to speak again before realizing that he couldn't remember the words it took to form the question he wanted to ask. His mouth closed, and he frowned at Yagi. "How do you feel?" Yagi asked, not seeming to notice Izuku's inner turmoil. He met his mentor's eyes, brows drawn together, as he struggled to think of the words it took to speak. It took way too long, but Yagi gave him that time, and eventually his brain slowly supplied the Japanese language back to him, and his shoulders drooped in relief. "What happened?" His shoulders went right back up as his voice came out wrong. Yagi did not visibly show that anything was wrong except for tensing, instead giving him a smile and a reassuring shoulder pat. "You don't need to worry about that just yet, my boy," Yagi said, and Izuku's frown deepened. He was missing something big. Did Dad hurt me again?" he asked, but that couldn't be it. His dad had left a long time ago, plus he had met All Might after that, hadn't he? Izuku was so lost. Yagi flinched at that, though, and Izuku suddenly felt very guilty. "No, Izuku," the man said, rubbing his shoulder gently. "This wasn't your dad." What? Izuku was just so confused, and he hated it. It felt like his whole life was a puzzle that had been broken into hundreds of pieces and then mixed up, and he couldn't put it together no matter how hard he tried. Yagi met his eyes, seeming to search them for something, and Izuku realized with a start that the man's eyes were watering. He couldn't remember if he had ever seen the hero cry before, and his guilt raised up inside of him even more. Sorry. No. Yagi set the back of his hand against Izuku's forehead, gently pushing him against the softness behind his head. "Don't be sorry. Nothing is your fault. You should sleep. It's 2 a.m. Now that he mentioned it, Izuku was very tired, his eyelids heavy. He looked at Yagi one last time, and the man gave him a reassuring smile. Izuku exhaled smoothly as his eyes slid closed. Yagi fell against the back of his seat as soon as the boy's breath evened out, and he ran a hand down his tired face, wiping his eyes. The doctors had said that he would most likely be confused, but Yagi hadn't been prepared for that. He looked over at the boy, his heart never failing to stutter in his chest at the sight. He had been with Izuku ever since he had left the ICU, the doctors allowing him to stay because he was literally the only emergency contact the boy had. It had been about a day now, and Izuku did look better, thanks to several different healing quirks, including Recovery Girl. But they could only do so much, and the boy before him barely looked like the Izuku he knew. There were dark black and blue bruises beneath his closed eyes, and his lips were dry and thin. His unruly, long hair had been shaved off in one spot, and the skin there was red with clamps holding the skin together, where they had to cut into his head for what they called a clipping. Brain surgery. Izuku had to have brain surgery to keep him alive because of his own quirk. He was sitting upright in the bed as well, reclining back slightly. According to the doctors, they had to keep his head elevated for a while, though Yagi didn't quite understand why. And his hand. The boy was missing the index finger on his right hand, the hand itself heavily bandaged, and Yagi had no idea how that had happened. There were also his ribs, which Yagi had managed to crack when performing chest compressions. He felt guilty about that, but the doctors had told him that it was very fortunate that he did that and so quickly, otherwise Izuku might not have made it. Those things and severe quirk exhaustion were the only problems, but they had been enough to almost kill him. It had killed him. He had died right in front of Yagi, and there had been nothing he could do about it because he had been too late. He had known there was something wrong, he had been able to feel it, and yet he had allowed Nezu to distract him with something pointless out of what? Politeness? All Might had never felt so pathetic as he did right now, and neither did Yagi. His regular form and his alter ego were both feeling so useless. If only he had been a little faster. If only he had left when he felt that he needed to. Yagi looked back at his sleeping successor. He didn't look content, his face pained even in sleep, a light grimace twisting his features. Yagi wondered if he was dreaming. He himself hadn't slept since he had seen the boy, wanting to be there when he woke up, despite how much it physically hurt him to see the boy so confused and lost. He hoped Izuku's memories came back. He had thought his father did this to him, put him in the hospital with such severe injuries, and that spoke volumes about what his father had actually put him through, and what his father was like, that Izuku believed the man could do something like this. Yagi didn't think it was possible, but he found himself hating the boy's biological father even more. And his mother, there had been no sign of her. Even if they couldn't get a hold of her, Yagi had seen on the news that the public knew about the attack. There hadn't been any names released, of course, per UA privacy, but it did say that there had been a student in critical condition. He would have thought any mother would have called, but no, there had been nothing. She hadn't even called Izuku's cell phone, which sat on the table next to him, charging, occasionally lighting up with messages from what appeared to be his classmates. Yagi didn't know what to do. He was so tired. The hero leaned back in his seat, tilting his head back to look up at the ceiling, his eyes slipping closed, and jerking awake at the sound of a door shutting. Yagi sat up quickly, heart pounding. "Sorry, Toshinori," Izuku's doctor said, looking slightly guilty as he walked toward the still sleeping frame of his successor. They had become relatively familiar with each other since Izuku had left the ICU, as Yagi had not left the boy's side. He and the doctor didn't really talk except to exchange names, though, the doctor actually coming in rarely, the nurses more often. Yagi glanced up at the clock, surprised to see that it was already 8 in the morning. He looked back at the doctor. "He woke up," he said, scratching at his face. The doctor hummed quietly at that, marking things down on a clipboard as he looked over the various instruments and things connected to Izuku. Yagi could tell he was still listening, though. "He was very confused," he explained. "He didn't remember anything, and he seemed to have his events in his life mixed up. That's understandable, and not at all unexpected, especially for his first time waking. He might not have been entirely—" The doctor waved a hand about. "Present. He has been on pretty heavy painkillers after all, which we're going to start weaning today." "Already?" Yagi sat forward, frowning. "Yes, Izuku is healing remarkably well. He will probably only have to stay here another day for monitoring, and then the rest of his healing he can do at home with some more mild painkillers." The doctor smiled at Yagi. "You're his father, right? You'll be taking care of him while he recovers." Yagi's heart stopped, and he blinked in shock at the doctor. I will be taking care of him, yes." "I'll make sure you get the care instructions then." The doctor stepped away from Izuku, moving toward the door. "The next time he wakes, he should be more coherent. If not, please call for a nurse and let them know. In the meantime, he really is healing well, and Dr. Tsubaki will be in shortly to do a healing session with him. After that, he'll be set to go home tomorrow." And with that, the man left. Yagi glanced back at Izuku. Dr. Tsubaki had been by once before. Apparently she was renowned throughout Japan as a very great healer and doctor. Her quirk specialized with organs, including the brain, and healing intensive damage to them. Without her, Izuku may have been a lot worse off. Yagi was glad that they were able to get her here. There was a knock at the door, and Yagi raised his voice, telling whoever it was to enter. "How's the little listener doing?" Yamada's voice yelled, the second he stepped into the room. Yagi sighed, reclining back. "He's doing better. He's being released tomorrow." Yamada's eyes widened behind his yellow glasses. The blonde was dressed as a civilian, his hair tied up in a messy bun on the back of his head, and he wore jeans and a long-sleeved shirt. He, too, looked incredibly tired. He probably hadn't slept much either since Aizawa had left the ICU as well. "Already?" The voice hero half screamed, still quieter than he usually was. "Yeah." Yagi looked down at the boy. "He woke up a few hours ago." Yagi shook his head. "He was so confused. He couldn't remember anything, and at first he was so scared. Yagi trailed off, scrubbing his face. The sound of Yamada's steps approached, and then his hand was on Yagi's shoulder. "It's going to be okay, all right?" He caught his almost slip-up halfway through and fixed it weakly. Yagi almost laughed. He had forgotten that he had told all the UA staff not to refer to him as All Might in this form. "How is Aizawa?" he asked instead of answering the blonde. Yamada sighed at Yagi's deflection before pulling up the other seat to sit next to him. "He's awake now and very bitter. He wants to come see him." "When is he being discharged?" Yagi asked, finally looking back at the man whose eyes were cast to Izuku's still form. "Today," Yamada sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Me and the doctors try to convince him to stay longer, but he's allowed to leave in a couple hours." Yamada swiveled his eyes over to Yagi's, and a chill swept down the man's spine at the cold seriousness in Yamada's orbs. "One more hit from that thing, and he very likely might have died," he said. "Izuku saved his life." They both looked down at the boy then. "It was close," Yagi whispered, barely audible. Yamada nodded, without answering. They sat like that for a moment, just watching Izuku breathe with the help of the tube in his nostrils. Yamada eventually stood, though. "Well," he said in English before switching back to Japanese, "I'm running home to grab Aizawa some clothes that aren't either a torn-up and bloodied uniform or a hospital gown." He pointed to Yagi. "And I'm grabbing you some food. What do you want?" Yagi shook his head. "I'm not." "You know what? It'll be a surprise." He headed toward the door, ignoring Yagi completely. "I'll see you soon." And then the door was falling shut behind him. Yagi sighed, and then turned away, pulling out his phone to see if he had any messages. About an hour later, Dr. Tsubaki stepped into the room, greeting Yagi before crossing the room to Izuku and checking his readings. She was tall, nearly as tall as Yagi himself, and she had long, straight purple hair held back in a ponytail. Even then, it went past her waist. Her eyes were bright green and almost seemed to be glowing, but that could have been a trick of the light. After writing down the readings, she set 2 hands on either side of Izuku's head and laid her forehead against his, closing her eyes. A moment passed, and Izuku's fingers twitched, and his eyes rolled beneath their lids. His heart rate jumped slightly, sounding off in the near-silent room, as Yagi leaned forward with concern. "It's okay, that's normal," the doctor answered softly, her eyes still closed. The healing session only lasted a minute or so before she was stepping back, wiping her stray hairs back into place on her head. She went over to Izuku's readings again, nodding to herself before turning back to Yagi. "You're his father?" she asked, and why did people keep asking him that? They looked nothing alike. "I am his—" Yagi hesitated, glancing at the sleeping boy. "I'm his guardian." He forced himself to smile at the doctor. She raised a brow but shrugged. "He'll probably be waking up within the hour. Please call for a nurse if you notice anything wrong. Otherwise, I don't see why he can't be released tomorrow." She beamed at him, and he bowed his head to her before she left in swift, long steps. Yagi turned back to Izuku. The grimace had eased from his face somewhat, and he seemed more relaxed in his bed. Yagi stood, stretching, his body cracking uncomfortably before he sat back down, preparing himself to wait for Izuku to wake up. When Izuku woke up, he remembered everything, and he was afraid. The quickening of the heart monitor began before he had even opened his eyes, and by the time he could do that, he was surrounded in a warm embrace. "It's okay," the voice said, and Izuku realized it was Yagi. "You're safe. You're in the hospital, but you're okay." Izuku was struck with a powerful sense of déjà vu. He was able to ignore it, though, more pressing things on his mind. Slowly but surely, the beeping returned to a calmer, more steady pace, and Yagi leaned back into his seat, one hand still grasping the boy's arm, as he couldn't exactly hold his hand from where he was at on the right side. Izuku turned his head to face Yagi, and his mentor squeezed his arm reassuringly. Aizawa sensei." Understanding flashed through Yagi's eyes. "I'm glad you remember. You didn't before." Izuku frowned. "I didn't." Yagi shook his head, reaching for the cup from this morning and helping Izuku drink. "You woke this morning, but you were very confused. I'm not surprised you don't remember that." Yagi took the now almost empty cup away, to set it back where it was. "Aizawa's okay, though, thanks to you, Izuku. He's being released today." Izuku exhaled in relief, leaning his head back into his pillow. Everyone else. His throat hurt, and his tongue was still thick, but he could speak much more easily now. Everyone else is fine. 13 was hurt, but they'll be okay, Yagi answered. Izuku frowned at that tidbit about 13, but accepted it. He didn't really have the energy to ask a lot of questions. His head hurt and itched, though, like bugs were crawling over his scalp. He reached his dominant hand up to scratch it, but froze when he caught sight of it. Of his hand. Of his finger. Or his lack thereof. Yagi saw the moment that Izuku noticed he was one finger short of the whole bunch. He heard the heart monitor jump again before the boy was looking up at Yagi with desperate, fear-filled eyes. Yagi was immediately up, off his chair, and hugging the boy again, rubbing circles against his back. Okay, Izuku said, and Yagi couldn't tell if he was talking to him or to himself. It's just a finger, right? Izuku swallowed thickly, and Yagi leaned back so he could look at him. He didn't know what to say to him. My boy, Yagi was rescued by the door slamming open, revealing the half-mummified form of Aizawa. Sensei, Izuku breathed, wide eyes looking across the room at his teacher. Aizawa stepped into the room, followed by a very disgruntled Yamada, who carried with him a bag of takeout which he handed to Yagi, with exasperation as the hero released Izuku to take it, shaking his head at his husband. Fuck. They both looked up at the sound of Aizawa's first word as he approached Izuku's bed, laying both hands on the side of it. Fuck, Midoriya. Your head. Izuku frowned, reaching up with his right hand, probably forgetting about his finger in the moment. He tried to touch his head, but Aizawa grabbed his wrist. Glancing back at Yagi, his lips set in a grim line. He just woke up, Yagi explained, and Aizawa looked back at the boy, who was looking up at him. He was shaking, and Aizawa still held his wrist. He set it back down, and Izuku didn't move it. What's wrong with my head? He said, his voice lower now, demanding answers. No one answered at first, all of them showing various forms of concern and horror, glancing among each other. What is wrong with my head, Sensei? His eyes narrowed at Shota, and the erasure hero sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. You know, the minute I saw you for the first time, I knew you'd be a problem child, Midoriya. He sighed again. Sensei! The boy practically begged, his fingers twitching, resisting the urge to scratch at his head. Aizawa glanced back at Yagi, who was watching them with concern. Toshinori, we've got this. You should go home and take a shower. You stink, the black-haired man stated flatly, and Yagi looked at him with mild irritation. He glanced back at Izuku and saw he wasn't looking at him, instead looking up at Aizawa. Yagi sighed and stood. Okay. He glanced at Yamada, raising the bag of food he grasped in his hands. Thank you, Yamada. The voice hero nodded to him, and Yagi left, the door swinging shut gently behind him. Aizawa then sat in the chair the number 1 hero had just vacated. He went to set his elbows on the bed, but stopped when the slight movement sent fire through the elbow that had been partially disintegrated and was currently wrapped in bandages. Instead, he settled for leaning back and looking at the boy silently. Eventually, it was Hisashi who stepped forward to Midoriya's other side, taking his hand in his and meeting his eyes. You had an aneurysm, Midoriya. You had to have surgery to fix it. Izuku leaned back against the pillows, brows drawn together. His right hand, the one not being held by Shota's husband, the one with the missing finger, reached up again, and again Shota caught it. I don't think you should mess with it. He himself was trying not to look at it, the sight reminding him of his failures. It was a crooked incision, held together by metal clamps, the hair around it shaved. I need to see, Izuku whispered, begging his teacher. After a moment, Shota reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. You have to stay calm, okay? He commanded, activating the front-facing camera and handing it to his student. Izuku nodded his answer, then took his hand from his English teacher's to grab the phone, not wanting to use his right hand for anything yet, with how much it was hurting. Izuku took a deep breath, and then pointed the camera at himself. Shit, he choked out, eyes widening. The eye bags beneath his eyes were just huge black and blue bruises. His face was ghostly pale, and his eyes were dull, lacking luster. There was a tube in his nose, providing clean air. His hair was greasy and needed a wash. On the side of his head there was the wound where it had gone into his skull, messed with his brain, and that thought had the phone slipping from his fingers, falling into his lap. He curled into himself, heart rate shooting up and his breath thinning, despite the tube in his nose. He'd had people in his mind many times now, but not his physical brain, without his knowledge or consent. Hey, Yamada said in English, rubbing his back. Shota leaned forward, standing. You said you'd stay calm, problem child, he accused, and leaned against the bed, wrapping his arms around the boy and pulling him against his chest, so that Midoriya could hear his own heart and feel his own warmth. Shota had seen him panic before, and he helped Hisashi with these types of attacks relatively often, so he was confident that taking advantage of his senses was the best way to help. The door to the room opened, and a nurse peered in, probably alerted by the much accelerated heart rate from the monitor. From the other side of the bed, Yamada tossed her a thumbs up and a smile, and she nodded, leaving them to help the boy. Shota turned his attention back to Midoriya, bringing his hand up to run it through his hair on the uninjured side of his head. Midoriya pushed his forehead against Shota's chest. He wasn't crying, but he was still struggling to breathe, his hands clenched into fists at Shota's side. Shota glanced at his husband, over the top of Midoriya's head, and the voice hero returned his look with concern, still rubbing the boy's back. Shota frowned, feeling Midoriya's grip on him tighten even further. He was worried about the hand, the one that's still bandaged to protect the wound left behind after a finger had literally been turned to dust right in front of Shota. Shota winced at that thought, swallowing, anger and frustration tearing him apart. In front of him, Hisashi was watching him worriedly, and Shota shook his head, going back to soothing the traumatized boy in front of them. Eventually, his grip relaxed and his breathing evened out, his pulse returning to normal as he fell lax against him, and Shota realized that the boy was asleep, practically cradled in his arms. He frowned, his back hurting. A shutter sound had him glancing up to see Hisashi pointing his phone camera at the two of them, a bright smile on his face. "Delete it," Shota said dangerously. "Nope," his husband answered in English. Shota glared, but it lost any effect it would have had if it hadn't been hidden behind a layer of bandages. Shota sighed in defeat, before adjusting his hold to swing one leg onto the bed, the other hanging off, reluctant to completely let go of Midoriya. He didn't want to admit it, but he was taking just as much comfort in feeling the boy present and alive against him as he had taken in having his teacher close. The erasure hero looked up at Hisashi, who was going through his phone, probably sending that picture to Namuri. Shota pushed down his frustration at that likelihood and spoke. "There's been no sign of his parents," Shota stated, and his husband looked up, his glasses on the end of his nose as he peered at Shota over them. "He had brain surgery, and they haven't even checked on him," Hisashi added, looking at Midoriya's sleeping face with sadness. Shota shook his head, then asked, "Do you recall Clause 31 of the Teacher's Handbook?" Hisashi raised a brow. "You actually read that massive thing?" Shota sighed, resisting the urge to rub his eyes. "Do you remember it or not?" "It's the one about the students as teachers' wards in an emergency, right?" Hisashi's eyes flickered with understanding. Shota nodded. "Can you call Nezu here? I'd like to talk to him." Hisashi made a face. "Sho." Shota shook his head, taking a deep breath. "It's my fault that he's like this. I didn't protect him. He protected me. I want to take care of him now. I need to." Hisashi's face softened. His husband wasn't usually very good at expressing his emotions, but Hisashi was a pro at picking up on the fine workings of Sho's head. He knew what he meant. "It's not your fault, Sho, but okay, I'll call him." Less than an hour later, they were all sitting in Midoriya's room while he slept. Nezu was sitting in a chair, Shota was still on the bed with the boy, and Hisashi remained in his seat, but it was near the others now. "I'd like to exercise Clause 31 of the handbook," Shota stated as soon as the principal had sat down. The mouse-bear thing did not look surprised that was why he had been called in. For a teacher to take into protective custody a student, is that right? Of course he was right. Shota didn't bother nodding to him, instead staring at him in the gap of his bandages. All might already ask this of me, but I believe the two of you would be a better option with your lack of media attention. They're still trying to get the name of the student injured in the attack, and All Might isn't the most surreptitious person. I knew you would ask, and I've already filled out the required paperwork. I just need your signatures. The duo blinked in surprise at the principal, who only laughed as he pulled out papers from who knows where and thrust them toward Hisashi. The length of time Midoriya would stay is up to the two of you, but the healing time is 2 weeks for his injury, though he should be back to normal in only a few days. The quirks these days do wonders for brain injuries. Shota narrowed his eyes. He had no idea how Nezu knew all of this, but he didn't question it. He gave that up a long time ago. The principal of UA had been and always would be an enigma. All Might came back while they were signing the papers, and the number 1 hero was quite confused as to why they would be caring for the boy when he had planned on doing so, but when they explained it to him, he seemed to accept it, if not begrudgingly, under the one condition that he would be allowed to visit and check on him. After that, it was just a waiting game for the couple, before they could take their temporary ward home. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 7 of State of Mind, a bit lengthier of a chapter. Chapter 8 will be up next. Please let me know your all's thoughts and reactions to this one, and as always, thank you so much for listening.